Well, as we mentioned a couple of weeks ago, God have mercy on all our souls, the political season is now upon us, particularly with the New Hampshire primary tomorrow and the fun Iowa caucuses this last week, and it just grows from there. And sometime over the course of the summer, the two, or actually three, four, five political parties will get together for their conventions. And one of those things that is in which a huge amount of time will be invested, with the results afterwards of almost being completely ignored, will be the platforms for each of the parties. They used to be a lot more important than they are now. The platforms of each party are essentially vision statements for what they think is important once a president and legislators on the national scene get elected. They're supposed to be priorities to pursue. If a Republican president and Congress are elected, they're supposed to pursue the statements of the Republican platform, the same with the Democrats. And the platforms used to be not all that different from each other. Now, reflecting probably the polarized nature of our society, they're very different. And once elections occur, usually what happens is that the ideals of the platform get ignored, because what has to happen from that point on is the practical realities of getting things done. In some ways it's sad. In some ways it's a relief that a platform doesn't get passed into policy or law, depending on which side of an issue you're on, of course, whether it's a sadness or a relief. Well, Matthew chapters 5 through 7 in the Gospel of Matthew are Jesus's platform. The ideals and priorities that he lays out for us to pursue as citizens of the kingdom of heaven. It's otherwise known as the Sermon on the Mount. It was kind of interesting when I was working on putting together this sermon together. I picked a title for it, and the title was Beautitudinally Speaking. And I plug it in to name the document, and I already had a Beautitudinally Speaking sermon, and it was from last year where I talked about the Sermon on the Plain and the blessings that were part of that, and it was the fact that it was Jesus's platform from the Gospel of Luke. So I had to change it, and now you see it's the Beatitudinal platform. Just a little side note. Luke's version was a lot harsher and blunter than Matthew's. And the words of Jesus there, and actually here a little bit later on, really come down hard on materialism and self-righteousness and attitudes. But Matthew's kind of the kinder and gentler version of the two. Now, this morning's gospel reading is the first 12 verses of that, and they're the Beatitudes, the statements of blessing. And I think that what Jesus was doing with these is not giving ourselves something to compare ourselves to, but rather to give ourselves something to aspire to. Usually when people read the Beatitudes, they go, well, gosh, am I poor in spirit? It may be that what we are called to do is to aspire to be poor in spirit. Basically what he's saying on this and the rest of the Sermon on the Mount is a vision of a radically different way of looking at humanity and relationships and the stewardship of creation and trusting God than what we normally practice as human beings. Where we normally like to strut our stuff and point out how wonderful we are, Jesus says, blessed are the poor in spirit. If we really take an honest look at the list here, it's not something that people would normally to aspire to, is it? I mean, honestly, is among your goals in life to be poor in spirit and mournful and meek and hungry and thirsty for righteousness and merciful and pure in heart and a peacemaker and a soul being persecuted for righteousness' sake? Probably wouldn't be very high on many of your lists of life priorities, right? Yeah, well, maybe we might have some half-hearted hope that we could be invested in maybe half of those, righteous, hungry and thirsty for righteousness, maybe meek sometimes, pure in heart, merciful. Those are good ones. It's not that we don't want to be good people. I think that most of us do. And most of us try to be such most of the time. But what Jesus is putting together in his platform, not just here, but throughout the Sermon on the Mount, is so much more than that. Jesus wants to take what is natural for us and surrender instead to the supernatural. And while we may wish for all of us to have blessings, he's trying to point out that those who are truly to surrender to God in all ways are the ones who embody all blessedness in all walks of life and ways of living. Those that are poor in spirit and meek and merciful and full of grief and hunger and thirst for righteousness are all others are from different souls from the norm. We in our sinful humanity are so used to looking out for number one, ourselves, because of our insecurity about our lives, that it takes for most of us a crisis to turn things into surrender to holiness. Those that have these beatitudinal priorities are already halfway there, you see. A person who is poor in spirit is one who's waiting for their souls to be filled. A person who is mournful, having experienced the painful blows of life and living, is looking for the comfort of God. Meek people don't get ahead a lot of places in life, but they are on their way to the true humility that reflects God's presence in their midst. If you hunger and thirst for righteousness, you have a vision for wholeness in this world and are willing to expend time and energy to pursue it, getting yourself outside of yourself. And the quality of mercy comes from that quality of grace in life. You are more willing to forgive because the God of eternal second chances has forgiven you. And being a peacemaker, well, that's one of the toughest jobs of all, because it puts you in the middle of conflict and chaos, trying to bring about resolution and that wholeness. And in that context, a true peacemaker will frequently be persecuted by those many who don't want peace, but are just wanting to continue the conflict and spread the maliciousness that comes with cultural habit of tribalism or lusting for power or just being one mean person. There's a lot of that too. These are the sorts of people in these beatitudinal blessings. These are the sorts of people that Jesus wants us to be and to become. And what that requires is turning away from normal life and surrendering to holy life. It means being transformed into a soul that puts all of their trust in God. That's the goal, people. That's the aspiration, the path, the journey that makes life more fully whole and holy. And the whole context of the Sermon on the Mount is that which takes what's in the standards for normal living and ratchets them up several notches. That's what happens during the course of the sermon. It's not just a matter of following the rules of the Torah or being moral or reaching out a little bit. This sermon, when first preached to the people of Judea, must have been terrifying and confusing to them because they'd been told all along that in order to be the chosen people of God, they had to follow the commandments of the Torah. Jesus is saying, no, it's more than that. You have to invest in the spirit of the Torah, which is the Spirit of God. You got to go above, beyond, through, way above that of just following the commandments. Talk more about that next week. Jesus didn't come to reform Judaism, nor did he come to start a new religion called Christianity. Jesus came to foment a revolution in the human soul and human culture. And we sinful humans, terrified by that, took the safe route and turned it all into a religion with rules to follow, with guidelines to obey. And the first of our reasons for doing that is the recognition that we can't do it. We can't transform ourselves into such powerful beings who are the light of the world. That's right, we can't do it. We instead have to surrender ourselves to God's grace that does the transforming. And all who go through those incredible pains of poverty and grief and hunger and mercy are closer to that surrender than normal folk just moving along and getting along. And that's why such souls are blessed. Because they're more apt to surrender. More apt to surrender to grace. More apt to surrender to most of us than most of us. So what may be impossible for us isn't impossible for God. Are we willing to surrender? To turn it over? To let go and let God? That's the central beatitudinal issue of Christian life. May you, may all of us be caught up in the blessedness of surrender. Amen.